Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Foraging Mushrooms with Naturalist Matt Welter. I'm here with Matt, and I'm going to be turning the program over to him in just a minute or two. Just a few announcements before we get started this evening. First off, if anyone has any questions or any comments, we'll get to them either at the end of the program or as the program goes along. Just type them into your the comment section on either Facebook or on YouTube, and they'll come through to me, and we'll take a look at them and get them to Matt. The other thing is, and I'm just going to start this scrolling across the bottom of the screen right now, and it is about mushrooms and mushrooms in the wild. So just to be perfectly clear, the responsibility for eating any personally foraged mushroom or fungus rests solely with the individual. Never eat any wild mushroom if you are not absolutely sure it is edible. Now, I'm going to put that scroll up a couple times during the program. I wouldn't be surprised if Matt also emphasized that as he went along. But make sure never eat any wild mushrooms if you are not absolutely sure that it is edible and non-poisonous. So that was the big announcement. I will probably make it at the end again. But right now, I'm going to turn it over to Matt. So, Matt, why don't you introduce yourself, and I'll get your PowerPoint set up, and we'll get rolling.
Hi, everybody. My name is Matt Welter. I'm a naturalist, and I've been working studying mushrooms for about 30 years, and I've taken people on lots of nature hikes. I've done it with several nature centers in our area, including the Navarino Nature Center, in just all sorts of different kinds of venues. And I got my start in finding mushrooms up on Isle Royal when I was a park ranger. I just picked up a copy of the Peterson Guide, and I really enjoyed looking through that and then finding the things that are out there. One of my personal phrases that I have is, you don't have to eat them to enjoy them. And actually, I've been looking, when I go out in the woods looking at mushrooms, I'm not just looking at the things that are edible. I find things that are smaller than your pinky fingernail. And I just love finding as many as I can and seeing what's really out there growing in the duff. So, are we just about ready with the PowerPoint?
We certainly are. I just didn't want to cut you off while you were telling everyone about yourself. I'm going to take myself out of the screen, and Matt, just have at her.
Okay. So when I talk about edible mushrooms, this was sometimes what I think people are looking for when they go out mushroom hunting. They want to find everything. They want to have it all brought together. And that's a really interesting concept. My baskets never look like this. I usually have paper bags or plastic bags, but usually paper bags, and several of them. And I package each of the specimens that I find, each of the different kinds of mushrooms, into those paper bags and keep them separate from each other. Because in that basket, this person may have had a really good lucky find, but if there is one mushroom in there that is poisonous, that mushroom that sits in there could give the toxins to the other edible mushrooms. And whenever I see something like this, and I've seen it on occasion, people will bring me a bucket full of mushrooms that they've, wanted identified. And I'll go, oh, this one's, a really good one. This one I'm not sure on. And this one, you're going to have to throw out that whole bucket now. And that's because when you want to learn how to look for edible mushrooms, the very first thing you need to know is this. Next slide. Make sure that you know what is deadly. And I'm going to go through some of the things that are deadly. And the way I had to do this was that I had to take a field guide, and I was on a little island out in Lake Superior, and I had to look through this, and I had to give myself rules about this. And number one, that I read over and over in every book, don't eat it if you don't know what it is, if you're not 100% sure. And so with that logic, I went through the guide and immediately found out what is actually deadly, what will kill you. And so go ahead and go to the next slide. One of the most things that I noticed the most is a family called amanitas. Amanitas are those old hippie poster kind of mushrooms that you've seen on old 60s magazines and stuff. It's got usually the red top and the white dots all over it. It usually also has a long, thin stalk, and it's very tall, and it's very big and beautiful. But the thing is that it's also in a family that has very deadly mushrooms. Next slide. So an example of that is on the left, there is an amanita that is called the deadly angel or the destroying angel. And anything that has the word deadly in it, that absolutely should be avoided. The one on the right is an amanita that's from our area. You know, I was talking about the red with the white dots a minute ago. In the Lake Superior and Great Lakes region, ours is a yellow mushroom with white dots on the cap. The white dots are called warts. And there are some other things that'll tell you on this amanita that it is an amanita. For one thing, it has a scalloped edge. If you look on the right at the very edge of the cap, you can see that there are parallel lines. So that's a distinguishing feature. Another thing, besides the warts and the scalloped cap, is that underneath the cap, you can see it in the picture on the left, there is a veil. And that's like a skirt at the top underneath the cap. And at the bottom in both pictures, you can also see another little sac-like structure, and that's called the vulva. And so if it's got the veil and the vulva, it's more than likely amanita mushroom. But you also want to look for the scalloped edge. And one of the things about the amanita is that there is one edible species in that group, but I'm not going to touch it, and it's called Caesar's amanita. Why would you eat something that has Caesar's name in it? Well, I guess we eat Caesar salads. But the thing is that it is the only one that is edible in the family. The rest of the mushrooms in this family can cause all sorts of death on one hand within about 24 hours. The guess who the one on the right in this picture, doesn't cause death unless you eat too much of it. But what it will cause is about 6 hours of vomiting and excreting simultaneously, followed by 6 hours of seeing God, and then 6 hours of vomiting and excreting simultaneously. So you just are pretty much puking your guts out for a few hours of hallucination and maybe death. So I don't think we want that one. Next slide. Another family that is quite deadly is the webcap family. And it's called that because it has this cottony webbing that stretches from the stalk to the edge of the cap. In some of the webcaps, all you'll have is the fuzziness at the top of the stalk. But some of them, it'll be really distinct. You'll see lots of this cotton. This mushroom can kill you, but it has a little weird side effect. You don't feel anything for 2 weeks, and then you just die. And so I've always thought this would be a great murder mystery kind of mushroom. Usually the cotton, the web caps are really good to look at and smell. They have interesting scents to them. They have lots of interesting colors, from a sort of moonlight blue color to several rings around the stalk that are multicolored. This one here is called a cinnabar. All right, next slide. Another really bad family is the funnel cap family. And this is pretty easy to recognize right away. You can see on these two things that it looks like the cap is forming a funnel, and it will cause severe gastric upset and distress. And it does lead me to another kind of mushroom. Next slide, please. And that is that one of the things that I find deadly is a lot of times, or at least poisonous, is LWMs or little white mushrooms and LBMs, little brown mushrooms. There were some nights that I would sit up with a mushroom, looking at it, doing a spore print, trying to identify characteristics, going through all sorts of different kinds of keys, and I could not figure it out. And so I just called it a little brown mushroom. And I learned that from one of the books. But they are little brown and little white mushrooms are really hard to distinguish from one another unless it has something like a unique scent that smells distinctly like almonds, or if it has a unique color of spore print. But most of the time, it's very hard to tell these apart. And so when in doubt, just throw it out. Next slide. Here's one that people mistake for another mushroom in our area, and that is the morel. This is a false morel. I'll show you a little the true morels in a little bit here, but the false morel has more of a brain-like structure to it, and they're more plentiful usually than morels, and they look all kind of twisty and wiggity-waggity. But they have an ingredient in the mushroom called monomethylhydrazine, which is also an ingredient that NASA uses for jet fuel. So it's extremely poisonous and it can lead to death. I have heard of people eating these, but usually when they say that they eat them, they parboil them outside so they don't inhale the fumes. Still, I would not even trust this, and I've never tried it. Okay, next slide. It has all sorts of contusions on it, and it does, from a distance, kind of look like a pine cone, but that brain-like structure, you can see it's just like a brain out there. So they're really interesting and neat to look at, but don't eat them. Next slide, please. This one is one of those little brown mushrooms that I was warning you about, but it's a very distinct brown one. It's called the deadly gallerina. And remember what I said about deadly? It's, like I said, a little brown mushroom, and it's very deadly. Usually comes out in the spring and the fall. Next slide, please. So does this little mushroom, which is called a winter mushroom. And the winter mushroom has this velvety stalk that you can see on the right. It has more widely spaced gills. The gills are wider, and it has a really slimy texture to it. And it usually comes either just a little bit before or a little bit after the gallerina, depending on if it's coming out in the spring or the fall. Just want to show you that deadly gallerina again, just for comparison. You think you could keep these straight out in the woods? How about if it's raining? You think you're going to be able to keep them straight? So you could easily mix these up. Fortunately, next slide, please. You can get this mushroom without having any risk of poisoning by going to your local Asian store. It's called an enoki mushroom. This is the cultivated version of it. And essentially the Japanese have been cultivating the previous edible mushroom for a very long time. And so you can actually get to taste it. By the way, I have found the enoki in the wild, and it is very interesting. Okay, next slide, please. So there are some mushrooms that you also have to be careful about, and they are edible mushrooms, but you have to take a certain amount of caution with them. Not all mushrooms that are poisonous are deadly. Some of the mushrooms that are out there that are poisonous will give you diarrhea, or they will make you throw up for a while, or they'll make you feel dizzy. There's even one that's called a sweat mushroom, which will make you sweat extremely profusely for about 8 to 10 hours. So, not all the poisons are deadly toxic. Next slide. So this is an inky cap. And an inky cap is one of those mushrooms, you've probably run over them with your lawnmower, that comes up and it looks really nice. It comes up very quickly. It's about 6 inches tall, and then it starts to liquefy. And the ink, what it is, you can actually use the ink in the inky cap to draw or write if you'd like to, but it's the spores way of spreading. It goes right into the ground and into the soil there, and it leaves just the stalks, like in the bottom, behind. So next slide. And they are edible, but if it's got ink and you drink a little alcohol, you could get really sick. I have a friend who told me that he was on a date once where he went for a hike with a young woman, and they caught some fish, and then they got some wild leeks, and they found some inky cap mushrooms to cook with the wild leek and the fish, and he opened up a bottle of homemade wine, and about 2 hours later they were both on the couch throwing up simultaneously for hours on end. So if you eat inky caps, you cannot have alcohol 24 hours before or after eating them. Okay, next slide. A safer species in this family is the shaggy mane, and it doesn't have the same alcohol problem, but I still kind of monitor my alcohol whenever I try these. They usually come in large troops. There is one case where you can get poison from them, and that is if you find them like in a city park where just a week ago they put all sorts of pesticides down, the mushrooms can absorb the pesticides. Or if it was even sprayed directly on the mushroom to try to get rid of them. Some sort of herbicide was sprayed on it. These ones I like to cook in a little bit of batter, and like a beer batter. And they have a real interesting texture to them. They also have kind of a scrambled eggs-like flavor to them. Okay, next slide. There are also other kinds of inky caps in our area, and some of them are edible, some of them are undetermined. Nobody, it's kind of a rarer inky cap, like the one in the center and the bottom, where it's got all that velvet all over it, that, people don't find much, so people don't try it. The one that's up in the upper left here is kind of a mica inky cap, and those inky caps are small, and they have a little interesting texture to them. But I wouldn't say they're one of the greatest mushrooms in the world to try. Just because it's edible doesn't mean it's good. I mean, how many of you don't like broccoli or cauliflower? Okay, so next. Puffballs are always a wonderful find, and they can grow in small clumps like this, or clusters, which is a smaller puffball. Next slide. They sometimes have interesting spines all over them, and they make great pictures. Next slide. But there are some caveats to eating puffballs. Number one is that you don't eat them if they're giving out their pores, their spores. Also, if you cut them open and you find yellowish or brownish areas that have started to liquefy, don't eat them. They'll make you sick. A few years ago, next slide, there was, when you find the giant puffballs, this is actually a remnant of a giant puffball, and there was an internet story that went around a few years ago about a guy who fell into one of these, inhaled a lot of it, and got a disease in his lungs. And that disease is called lycoperidonitis, and that's coming from lycoperdon, which is the scientific name for puffball. And it got this thing where people were asking me all the time, even when I would demonstrate, if you tap the side of a puffball and the smoke kind of comes out, they're like, oh, that's dangerous. We know how the internet sometimes blows things out of proportion. It's really rare to find people who have caught this. It's more common to find it in dogs who are out sniffing your puffballs. Okay, next slide. But I like to have a little bit of fun with puffballs. The giant puffballs that you can find out there are pretty tasty, and people do enjoy them. I think they kind of have a light scrambled egg-like flavor. And when I find the giant puffballs in August, usually in river bottom areas, they're really nice to find. And, you only need about one to feed yourself. But again, cut it through and through and make sure of two things. If you're using the giant puffball, make sure there's nothing that's just decaying in it. But if you're doing the smaller puffball, cut it in half and also look for the outline of a mushroom. If you see the outline of a mushroom, you are not looking at a puffball. You are looking at a very young Amanita mushroom, and you certainly don't want to eat that. By the way, the snowman on the left is 3 puffballs, and the eyes are carbon balls. I like finding 3 different sizes of one, sticking a stick through the largest, then stacking them up on each other, and then just sitting in the woods and listening to people as they walk by and say, "What's a snowman doing out here in the middle of August?" All right, next slide, please. Coral mushrooms are prolific, and to me, the ones I have tried are kind of watery. I'm not sure why people like to eat them, but they're just so pretty to look at. The coral mushroom's Latin name is Ramaria, and Ramaria is Latin for to flow through. And a lot of coral mushrooms, the side effect is that they give you diarrhea. So it'll flow through you all right. This one, by the way, is called crown coral. If you look at the individual branches, you can see little crowns on top. Next slide. This one is called green-tipped coral, and it's also got real distinct little tips that the ends of it are all got little green spots on them. And next slide. One mushroom that I kind of wish I could eat, but it's never been listed as being edible, is this one right here. It looks like about the size of a football, and it has this pink color to it. But the thing that's most amazing about this particular coral is that it smells like black pepper. And if you ever find it, I guarantee you, just kneeling down and smelling it is worth the smell down there. But again, we don't have to eat them to enjoy them. Next slide. Some people have found that they'll eat anything. There was a researcher whose name was McElveeney, and he would eat just about anything. And I read that he ate this yellow coral mushroom. In other guidebooks, I had read that it said too bitter to eat. So I tried a bit of one, and I was spitting for 15 minutes. It is the most bitter thing I have ever tasted. And how Mr. McElveeney ever ate this mushroom, I'll never know. Next slide, please. Morels. This is everybody's darling favorite mushroom. And in our region of Wisconsin, people hide where their patches are really well because they're not as frequent. But if you go to southwest Wisconsin, they have a huge festival for morel huntings, and people are finding them by the basketful. By the way, as far as foraging, I'm a person who finds that if I find something, I'm lucky to find it, and I don't necessarily have to harvest it. One thing that I do if I find morels is I count them, and I only take about half to 2/3. I always make sure there are some that are left. You'll notice also that I cut the bases. We want to not just pull them out of the ground. We want all the mycelium, the stuff that grows underground, that's the real mushroom, to keep growing. So what I like to do with them is cook them morels in butter. And some distinguishing features you can see of the morel is you can see that it has a pitted side, and it has usually a stalk. If you cut them the long way, you'll see it's just one hollow chamber. So next slide, please. And when they're growing, they also look kind of like pine cones. So if you think you're under a pine tree and you think you're seeing pine cones, look again, it might be morels. If I found this patch with only 3 of them, I probably wouldn't take any of them because to me, you know, it's just not worth it. So next slide, please. Remember there was another thing that we said looked like pine cones and is kind of different. Just go back once so that we can see the morel again just for comparison. Oops. Well, we could do that too. Okay, backwards. There we go. You see the pitted sides? It isn't all wavy all across. It's more straight. It sort of leans to one side, but it's usually very straight. Whereas again, the highly deadly, next slide, false morel doesn't have the pits. It's got the brain-like structure, and it's got several chambers inside if you cut it longitudinally. Okay, next slide. By the way, the morel's flavor is really subtle. And even when you pick it up, you can smell the flavor of it. And what I say about morels, why I like to cook them in just butter with just a little bit of salt, maybe some pepper, is I want to savor that flavor. I've seen people take these morels and cook them up with bacon and tomatoes and all sorts of stuff. And while it's an interesting little pop of flavor there, it's still sort of covering it up. So you really want, if you're finding these are like gold. Next slide. Another gold thing that we have that's out there that we love is chanterelles. And chanterelles are just a marvel to find. Usually you can find them in about the 4th of July, or as I like to say, when I see the violet leaves start getting yellow spots on them, that's when I know chanterelle season is beginning. Also notice around the chanterelle, there's lots of dark soil. That's one of the things you're going to need is really dark lignous soil, usually with some moss growing nearby. The smell of the chanterelle is like pumpkin, and it's a real subtle smell. I like to take them, take about 6 of them and make schnapps out of them. But if I'm cooking with them, I like to cut them up into larger pieces, and I like to simmer them slowly in butter in like a chicken breast so that the chicken breast also gets the chanterelle flavor. One of the key things about the chanterelle that makes it more identifiable is the false gills. The things that look like gills underneath the cap, you notice they branch off and they break off. They're usually kind of wavy. They're not like true gills. And most of the members of the chanterelle family are edible except for, next slide, this one here, which is the scaly chanterelle. And even its gills are really weird shaped. And this one is usually twice as large as the regular chanterelles, and it also can cause some really severe gastric upset. So you want to avoid this one like crazy. Next slide. We actually have 9 species of chanterelles in the state of Wisconsin. This one here I like to call the swamp-loving chanterelle because I usually find it in wet, swampy areas, and it doesn't have much of the flavor. So I've never collected it for eating and harvesting. But when you find the true chanterelle, you've struck gold. And I would, if I were you, make sure that you not only know that it's a true chanterelle, because there are some things that look like it. One of them is a mushroom that's called the false chanterelle, and the false chanterelle has true gills on it, and it is deadly. So you have to kind of be aware of that one. Next slide. But look at how beautiful the false gills are on this swamp chanterelle. And sometimes when you're looking for these things, you find other things. This little cup fungus was right next to this little swamp chanterelle, and it just looked like a little fairy habitat there. One of my favorite things to do, besides looking for edible mushrooms, is to find as many species as I can in just one area. And so, for example, I'll sit on a log that I see one mushroom on, and then I start counting the mushrooms, the other species of mushrooms that are on the log, and then 10 feet around that area. And I've gotten up to 40 species in one little 10-foot area before. And most of them are very tiny and minute. So get yourself a macro lens for your camera. Next slide. This mushroom has a local name, and people often call it cinnamon tops. It took me years to figure out what cinnamon tops were. It's called in many guidebooks either the honey mushroom or ringstock mushroom, but usually honey mushroom is the most common name. On the left, you have the scaly versions of it, and on the right, you have the scaleless versions on them. But both of them grow in large clusters in the late fall, and both of them have a really good flavor to them. There is one caveat, though, and that is about 1 out of every 10 people are allergic to it. And I'm one of them. And what will happen is if I eat more than about 3/4 of a cap, I start just kind of feeling like something is off in my stomach. And I've had it before where I ate like 3 caps and I just didn't feel like eating for the next like 24 hours. So I do have the allergy to this one. Next slide. Another family that you can find edible ones in, but with caution because about half of the species in it are toxic, not deadly, but they'll make you feel sick, is the brittle gill. And the brittle gill mushroom is called so because its gills break off really easily. Like the amanita, it has the scalloped edge to it, but something that's really distinct about it is that the shorter, thicker stalk is like a piece of chalk. If you hold on to it, it'll snap just like a piece of chalk and make a nice, clean, even snap. Also, some of them have really interesting scents to them. The one in the upper left is an almond scented one, but it's also called the stinker. And that's because it smells wonderful when it's fresh, but about a day or two later, it just smells awful. And you definitely don't want to eat that one. If it smells bad, you know it's probably not tasty. Next slide, please. A similar species, but doesn't have the stalk that breaks quite as easily, is called a milkcap. You see in between the gills, there's little bits of fine milk. In that area, when you open these up, you crack them open a little bit, and some of them will have a latex that comes out that is white and then turns clear. There's some that it turns yellow. Some of them turn yellow slowly. But it'll have some sort of distinct latex inside of there, and this kind of bubbly inner part of the cap. Next slide. One of them that people see every year is the cotton roll milkcap down in the lower left and on the lower and then on the upper left. The cotton roll milkcap lasts a long time. It isn't edible. However, it can get this one kind of mushroom that attaches to it and covers it with orange pimples, and it becomes this totally edible lobster mushroom, which has this surface that looks kind of like a lobster shell, and it kind of tastes like lobster too. On the upper right-hand side, there's a one that's called a powder puff. Some of these milk caps actually have a velvety finish on the outside of them, and this one isn't edible. And in fact, any of them that have this velvety finish on them is not edible at all. It's toxic. But what's interesting about the powder puff is the kind of latex it has. It has a white latex, but if you take just put a little bit on your tongue, it burns like a hot pepper. And if you can spit it out several times. That's how you don't ingest the poison. Rinse your mouth out. The small amount that'll be on your tongue won't kill you, but the burning might. Next slide, please. One of the edible ones that you can find in this is the one on the left. And the one on the left, that's upside down, is an orange milkcap. And orange milkcaps are usually edible, but there are some species that are not. Again, you have to know the distinct characteristics. But there is some of it that can grow in what's called cedar peat. And if it's underneath the cedar tree and you try to taste it, it is this horrible flavor that tastes like dirt and cedar. So just because it's edible doesn't mean that if it's growing in a different kind of habitat, it doesn't taste good or bad. On the right is one that's called the candy cap mushroom, and this is my favorite milkcap, and I've actually found that here in Manitowoc. And the thing about the candy cap It's a smaller milk cap, usually has a darker color to it. And when you heat it up a little bit, even in the palm of your hand, it has the distinct smell of brown sugar and maple syrup. It is just rich with sweetness. And if you're lucky enough to find one of these or a couple of these, I like to take them and chop them up and put them in shortbread. But you can also put them in an envelope to dry and smell them 15 years later. They still smell like that. In Japan, they cultivate this mushroom and put it in as an herbal supplement, and people eat it on a daily basis so that their sweat smells like maple syrup. Okay, next slide. So here are some easier to identify mushrooms. The next, sulfur shelf. We have a few species of sulfur shelf in our area, and one of them grows on a certain kind of tree, a hardwood tree, or maybe it's hemlock. You have to look it up. But it is one that can make you feel sick. The other ones are totally edible, and not only are they edible, they're easy to tell. They're very large. You'll hear people going ooh and ah as they're walking by it because it's so unusual. You simply take a knife and cut off the loose ends. Don't take any part that's really fibrous because it's like chewing on a piece of wood. And you cook it up, and it not only has the taste of chicken, but the texture of chicken too. Next slide. There is another way that this mushroom can be toxic, is that when it's gone too far. I have found people who will find moldy versions of this, or they put it in their refrigerator and they don't eat it for a couple of weeks and decide they're going to eat it anyway because they picked it. You wouldn't eat moldy broccoli. Don't eat the moldy mushroom. Next slide. Hen of the woods is also extremely easy to identify. It usually comes in these large clusters, usually on the roots of oak trees, and it's got a really good chicken-like flavor. Again, you cut off the parts that are tender, and you don't take the parts that are woody and fibrous. Next slide, please. My favorite spring mushroom that comes out in the earliest parts of spring, usually should be out, in fact, next week probably, is a dryad saddle mushroom, also called the pheasant back because it has this feathery look on the top of the cap. Next slide. One of the things that makes this mushroom really interesting is it has these elegant looking pores underneath it. And people who see it, they often say that it looks really beautiful. If you go in a little closer, go ahead and next slide. You can see just how pretty these pores are. The other thing that is a distinguishing characteristic of it is that it smells like cucumbers. And when it's got really young, you can cut it up and put it into, like I put it into an oil vinaigrette and slowly simmer it. And you get that cucumber flavor and you get the oil and vinegar flavor. It's really nice. Interestingly enough, this mushroom can reproduce several times during a season, and it gets larger with more watering. In fact, I once went to a geocache that was in De Pere that said, bring a water bottle with you. And to my surprise, when I got there, there was a funnel attached to the side of a tree, and underneath it was a dryad saddle mushroom. And it was one of the largest dryad saddle mushrooms I've ever seen in my life. And of course, I emptied my bottle of water onto it too. Next slide, please. Hedgehog mushrooms come in two forms. One is the kind that grows on the sides of trees. The true hedgehog, also called the goat's beard, is on the left. And the one that's on the right is more of the spreading hedgehog. And I've seen that one up in the Porcupine Mountains in just hundreds of them. The one on the right is a little more watery than the one on the left, but both of them have a taste that's sort of like shellfish. And it's really a wonderful, flavorful thing. Usually you don't find many of them, especially the one on the left. However, one thing that I have noticed is the one that grows on the left is usually also on birch trees that have the clinker polypore, the mushroom that looks like burnt marshmallows on the side of birch trees. Okay, next slide, please.
Matt, is it okay if I ask you a question?
Go for it. Sure.
Someone named Raven Bishop just pointed out that these two mushrooms grow in her backyard.
Oh.
And it tastes great. And she was wondering specifically what your area is when you reference your area where you look for mushrooms, because she is in Northeast Arkansas watching you.
Okay. So thanks, Raven, for that question. I'm really glad that you have these, and you're very lucky to have them in your backyard. The area that I'm referencing is Northeast Wisconsin. That's where we're broadcasting from is Manitowoc. And so I've been in the Northeast Wisconsin area for a long time. Thanks for that. Let's go on. Yep. The other kind of hedgehog you can find looks like a mushroom, what we typically think of a mushroom with a cap and the stalk. But when you look underneath it, you find these little teeth that are called, that look like, they're called hydnellum. They look like little icicles, and they fall off if you just rub your fingers on them. They're kind of soft, but even if you don't see them, you can feel them under the cap, and that's always just a little delight. These mushrooms, like the chanterelles, they have a nice firm texture like the chanterelle does. And what I like to do with them is, again, cut them up into larger chunks and slowly simmer them in like a chicken breast or something like that. Very tasty, and you're lucky if you find them. They do like the chanterelle, like the dark soil, and they usually grow in clusters of about 10 to 15. But if you're not watching, you might think, oh, that's just a little brown mushroom. Next slide, please. Cornucopia mushrooms, there's another member of the chanterelle family, and they're also called black trumpets. Usually they grow in troops of about anywhere from 10 to like 100. And they usually start forming in Wisconsin, Northeast Wisconsin specifically, in about late August. You might even see what looks like lots of little holes in the ground, and that's just the beginning of them. But when they come out, they come in profusion. This mushroom is very subtle flavor. It's really tasty, but extremely subtle. And so what I like to do with them is I cut them into rings, and then I serve them in Japanese soup. A nice, not a miso soup, but a thin broth soup with just a little bit of fish stock in it. And it's really flavorful. Next slide, please. Oyster mushrooms. We actually in Wisconsin have about 3 different species of true oysters, and they come out at 3 different times. One comes out in June, one comes out in about the middle of summer, and then one comes out in the late fall. And the thing about the oyster mushroom is it looks like a polypore or shelf mushroom on the side of a tree, but it has gills. And there are very few tree mushrooms that do that. The other thing that makes them really distinct, and you can't quite see it in this picture very well, there's just a little spot, is that if you start looking in between the gills, you find beetles. And to me, that's one of the things that really says it's an oyster mushroom. Also, the oyster mushroom has a slightly tacky cap to it when it's wet, so your fingers stick a little bit to it. And the gills go all the way down to the stem, and that's what's called decurrent gills. It means it continues beyond the edge of the cap down onto the stem. Next slide.
Is it okay if I ask you another question?
Certainly.
Haley Nagel was wondering, what nature parks in Manitowoc are the best for finding elm and birch trees?
Boy, I'd have to ask the crowd about that one. And I'm wondering if Haley is asking about elm and birch because of the fact that it's usually one of the things that if you were looking for morels, elm trees, especially dying elm trees, are really good things to look for. Also, the birch trees usually are the things you're going to find the honey mushrooms on. And in the nature parks in our area now, there's one that's north of you that I should know the name of because I've Woodland Dunes in Two Rivers, but they don't allow for collecting of mushrooms in that area. So you're going to have to, when looking at nature parks, you're also going to have to find out what their rules and regulations are about hunting mushrooms, because some of them allow them and some of them don't. I was just out at Maribel before I came here, and the same thing happened there. You know, I saw signs that said that everything that's here belongs here, and so you can't be collecting things from it. So I wish I could be more helpful as far as where you could go. For looking for elm, I would say look for a park that has some sort of stream running through it or river running through it, because the elm usually likes those wetter areas. And for birch, usually what I find is birch is a species. Well, you got your two birches in our area, and I'm going into this way too much, but your yellow birch will have the honey mushroom on it too. Now, one more thing to add to you about this, about birch. If you're going out and looking for those, Haley, one thing you should do is come to those birch trees that have the big gigantic roots on them about August and a little bit after sunset, because those honey mushrooms, their mycelium that grows on that root is what makes foxfire, and it glows in the dark. And I've actually seen this. And when I saw it, I had a little electric lantern with me, and I had been looking at this glowing in the dark for like 20 minutes. I went to switch off the light. I had already switched off. I could see all of the instruments and everything by the glow of the foxfire. But maybe somebody else can chime in and tell us where some of those good parks are in the Manitowoc area. Okay. Back to the oyster mushrooms. Here's the late summer oyster mushroom. You can see the gills going down the front. The oyster mushroom has that wonderful flavor that does taste like oysters. They're really good in soups. They're good in pastas. You know, the lighter pastas like with garlic butter. Next slide. And there is another kind of related edible mushroom that's also white, but a lot smaller. That's called angel wings, and it does have that same kind of oyster-like flavor, but that's just usually a little bit more watery. Next slide. Jelly mushrooms are the mushrooms that you can eat, but they don't have any flavor. And so what you use them for is absorbing the flavor of something else and getting the texture of it. The witch's butter mushroom is the orange mushroom that you see, and then the white one is the white witch's butter. And they usually come out several times on the same log, usually right after it rains. So if you know where there's a patch, you can keep harvesting them. I've cooked them in soy sauce and garlic. I've cooked them in spaghetti. They're just kind of a fun and interesting texture that you know you can eat. Most of the jellies that you can eat are pretty harmless in our area. Next slide, please. Here's another jelly. This is called a tree ear, and you can actually buy these in Asian markets too, and they're fun because you can get a small pinch of one. It looks about the size of like a six-sided die, and you put it in water and it grows to the size of a silver dollar or bigger. And you can dehydrate these mushrooms and save them and eat them again. But again, if you're looking for flavor, don't look to the jelly mushrooms, just, you know, for texture. Next slide. Black jelly is one that I like to give samples of at some of the hikes that I've done, and it's because it doesn't look all that appetizing, but it is prolific, and one of the places you can really look for it is on older alder trees. And by the way, if you see black jelly, start looking around for another glowing mushroom, because there is a kind of mushroom that grows on the sides of the trees. It's about the size of a penny. It has a distinct stalk and little brown gills on the underside. And when it gets in the right conditions, when it's wet, it glows in the dark, very subtly. But if you're in a very dark closet and you're looking at it, it can be really bright. Okay, next slide. Here's a close-up of that black jelly. Again, it just has a real distinct texture to it, kind of squishy. Next slide. There is a family called horsehair mushrooms, and in it there's one that's called a garlic pinwheel. If you look under the cap, you can see these little thin, fine stalks that actually look and feel like horsehairs, and that's how you tell it. If you go down to the ground in a patch of these and smell them, they smell like garlic. And you get about 100 of them. You can actually season something with it. They grow in very large troops. I've seen them out at Camp Tapawingo growing in clusters of like carpets of thousands of them, tens of thousands of them. It's an interesting, or what I call academic thing to try it out, but I would just rather get garlic most of the time. Next slide, please. Bolete mushrooms can be some of the most elegant mushrooms, but they can also be a little bit tricky. This bolete actually has, a really elegant appearance, but if you take a little taste of it, it's extremely bitter. Next slide. The birch bolete is a pretty easy one to identify, and it has all of these spongy-like pores underneath the cap. Usually the stalk has some sort of scales or scabbers on it. Another name for this one is aspen scabber stalks. It might have an orangish or chestnut colored cap to it. The flavor is really subtle, and it has a very different texture to it. But this one is kind of a boring member of its family. You can eat it, but it's not very tasty. Next slide. Sometimes things just scream, "Don't eat me," and this is one of them. This is a member of the family of boletes that you should not eat at all. This is called Satan's bolete. And if the color doesn't get you right away, one of the things that'll happen is if you cook this one up, actually, it turns dark blue. And I don't know, other than blueberries, what things you like to eat that are dark blue, but it can give you extreme gastric upset. But let's go back to some of those more edible ones. Next slide. The king bolete is a very large bolete mushroom with extremely fine pores until it starts to age, and then they spread out a little bit more. It has that bulbous base to it, really wide at the bottom, and it has a chestnut-like flavor or smell to it. It's also called the porcini mushroom, and if you've ordered porcinis and you know what they taste like, this is what it is. It's harder to find in the wild in our area, but there is a look-alike, and it's a little bit smaller, and it's called the queen bolete. It has a more yellow pore color underneath, and if you find that one, you've already lost it, because if you open up the cap, and this is something that makes it distinct that it's the queen bolete, it is ridden with maggots. It's practically grows with the maggots in them. So if you want a little extra protein and you don't mind the maggots, you could probably have it. But the thing is you really want the porcini mushroom, because then you can dry it out and have it later too. Next slide. One that I often find in my yard that's a bolete is a slippery jack. And if you're not watching where you're going when you're mowing the lawn, you might find out why these are called slippery jacks. They're usually lemon yellow on both sides. They stay lemon yellow. Some boletes, when you touch the pores, they turn different colors. The cornflower bolete, when you touch its white pores, it turns cornflower blue. This one is also tasty in that it has a lemony flavor. And my favorite way to cook these is to cook several of them on fish. And it gives you that lemon-like flavor with the fish. All right, next slide. So my big takeaway message for you is there's a lot of different kinds of mushrooms out there that you could eat, but eat the ones that are safe. If you're really in sort of some doubt or anything like that, just toss it away because it's not worth, risking your life over. Um, it's also, if you're having a hankering for mushrooms, go down to your local grocery store. There are a lot of different kinds that are out there nowadays. And if you want a little bit something different, go to a local Asian market. You might find some different kinds of mushrooms to try out. And with that, I don't even know how many people are online here, Craig.
Uh, there have been a varying amount of people. There have been people coming and going. I don't know exactly how many until we're done, and then I get the final count. So I can provide you with that. But we still have Matt here for a little bit yet. So if anyone has any questions, please go ahead. Questions, comments, type them into the comments area. I just also wanted to mention fantastic photos, Matt. I mean, they're absolutely
Thanks.
and fascinating to look at, and the information that you provided was also phenomenal. So thank you for this great presentation. Just so much I didn't know, and I always love learning new things. So if anyone has any questions or comments, we still have a few minutes, so get your questions in because we have a great source of knowledge here. Just also wanted to mention one last time, just to make it perfectly clear, I know Matt just hit this, but the responsibility for eating any personally foraged mushrooms or fungus rests solely with the individual. Never eat any wild mushrooms if you are not absolutely sure it is edible. So I don't think that we could have made that more clear during it. Just in case you were wondering, don't eat it if you don't know what it is for sure. And that seems pretty straightforward. But we have a couple of comments coming in. One from Marietta Higgins. Thank you. This is very informative. Bonita Ray said, very interesting. Thanks for this program. So thank you, Matt. And Marietta actually also had a question. She was wondering what time of the year is best for morels?
The morel season usually starts in about the second week of May. I had a friend who used to tell me that morel season was when the oak buds on the buds on the oak tree were the size of mouse ears, but that was probably obfuscating because I've never been able to figure it. They're always that small. But May through about the first week, sometimes the second week of June is morel season in our area. Another good place to look for morels that's kind of surprising is junkyards. For some reason, if you have like an old junk pile in your backyard that has a lot of metal in it and some rust in it, sometimes they'll show up. There's another morel called the burn site morel that'll show up in a place that's been burned in the last few years. And another place that if you know of an old orchard that has gone out of business and they're cutting down their trees, the next 5 years, they're going to be having lots of morels because morels are attracted to the roots of decaying fruit trees. So,
good information. Haley, who asked you earlier about the elms and birch trees, said she got a lot out of this, and she was wondering when your hike was going to be.
I haven't lined up any hikes yet, and that's because of COVID more than anything else. The CDC is, saying that if you're outside away from, you're pretty much safe with or without a mask unless you're in close contact with a group of people for a prolonged period of time. And so usually the hikes that I've had either at Navarino or at Woodland Dunes. So I would watch those guys' web pages for something like that. But we've got to get through COVID first.
So another good reason to go out and get vaccinated so that we can get back to hikes, correct?
Mm-hmm.
I can put that little plug in. I'm not affiliated with anybody, but all right. If anyone has any more questions, now is the time to ask because we have only about a minute or two left in the program. So any other questions? Feel free to ask them quickly.
Oh, yeah, you should make a mention that this is going to be on the YouTube for the next 2 weeks, right?
Correct. This program, like just minutes after we end tonight, this will be on YouTube for the next 2 weeks for sure. And it will be on Manitowoc Public Library's Facebook page also. It will be archived, as long as there is Facebook. It will be on just go to the videos page, and it will be the first one in the recent videos. And on our YouTube channel, our Facebook address is really easy to give, so I'll give it. It's www.facebook.com/Manitowoc Library, all one word, all lowercase. The YouTube one is a little bit more complex, so what I would suggest, just go to YouTube, search Manitowoc Public Library, and this will be the first video that pops up because it's the most recent. But that's for the next 2 weeks, and on Facebook, you can look forever pretty much. So no more questions have come in. Just wanted to make mention that a week from tonight, we have another StreamYarding program going out on both Facebook and YouTube. Not as gorgeous of pictures, but definitely a lot of information. Manitowoc Public Library's Julia Lee will be presenting Fact versus Fake, which is about where can you find reliable, good information online. With so much bad information, we're going to try to steer you towards some really solid information. So that's next week, Thursday, May the 6th, and that starts at 6 p.m. But thank you very much, Matt, for this wonderful presentation. Thank you very much to everyone who joined in this evening. A lot of great things to look at, a lot of good information. So until next time, thank you again, Matt, and everyone, have a great night.